Firstly, thank you for hosting this event. Thank you for inviting us. I've had a number of detailed conversations about climate data that I don't think I've had since I was an undergraduate learning things about climate change at the Climate Research Unit in University of East Anglia in the UK. So I haven't worked directly in climate change data, but I have worked in data markets and very different data markets around, both in the UK, Europe, and now Canada. And many of which were related in applications related around climate change and climate adaptation. So very briefly, who is Mars and why are we here? Well, Mars is here because we think the future matters. And we think the future depends on our social, economic, and our environmental prosperity. And that means our ability to innovate and to adapt to the future and to create the future we want is fundamental. And the core of that, ultimately, we believe, is around innovation and entrepreneurship as being the key engines. Our ability to create new science and knowledge, our ability to turn that into valuable products, services, and changes in the public and the private sector. And that capacity is entrepreneurship. So we teach and we manage and we deliver entrepreneurship. We work with over 1,200 client companies developing technologies across every field. About a quarter of that stuff is in clean technologies. About 80% of all venture capital deal flow in clean tech goes through Mars clients. So we're super interested in, broadly, the role of technology in helping our society, both public and private sectors, adapt to things like climate change and other phenomena. And we also do a lot of work convening people from a different sectors. So we convene and work across academic, finance, private sector, government, and other regulated aspects to deal with some of the systematic challenges in making those innovations come to light. And my colleague Sasha will talk about one particular systems intervention we did that was related to data. Maybe it's some inspiration as to about what does it mean to intervene in a complex system driven by data. And I guess super high level, there's two things it could be doing. One, it's got a role in directly using data and producing data products and data services and consuming data products, and we've heard a bit about that. But stepping back a bit more broadly, the role of the private sector is to help our society to adapt to a climate change. It has a massive responsibility and necessary need to in itself be a user of climate information. And so what does the private sector do? And one of the biggest things the private sector does is manage risk. Every business has to manage all sorts of risks. And of course, the one place you see this most in the climate change context is insurance. And the biggest use case you're seeing around that, because it's becoming more immediate, is flood insurance. And I'm just going to actually pick an example here from the UK about why data matters to flood insurance. And it's a bit of a no-brainer. But there is actually the accumulation of risk in flood is leading to a market failure. The insurance industry would choose not to insure for flood large elements of the UK. And the same thing's happening in the USA. So what there was actually was a coordinated release of data, geospatial data, the hydrological model, the flood model, the geological model, the coastal model, as well as future predictions around the flood curves. So the insurance industry had the capacity to adequately model and deal with that. And partly, privately, because the insurance industry actually got ahead of the government's capacity and had a better flood model in the public sector. It went and flew and captured better data. And the agencies responsible, actually you worked for one of the agencies in this picture, actually had to kind of catch up, in all honesty. And that's a country which actually has good data to do this stuff. And so the presence and availability of that data lets that insurance industry now reach common agreement, currently they're called agreement and principles, about how they share the risk. And there's an emergence of something called Flood Re. There's going to be the emergence of a agreed way we manage risk, and data underwrites how an entire industry chose to absorb risk it otherwise wouldn't. So very simply, if we don't have climate data, you'll have market failures. The market needs it to absorb market failures. In this case, risk insurance. It could be a whole bunch of other market failures if that risk accumulates and it doesn't have capacity to respond. I guess the next big one we're starting to see a lot of in the press, and the financial press, is often you'll see it being reported as investor activism. But fundamentally, it's investors saying, we need to think fundamentally about how we allocate our capital. And that's the other job the private sector does on scale. And again, the banking industry and the pension funds, long-term pension funds, are the people who are thinking about this most. So the Investor Network and Caliper, the California insurance group, are one of the most active. This is another study that struck me as being very interesting by Mercer, but was directly trying to interpret what do the forecasts mean, and how do we translate that into likely scenarios and likely asset allocations. So it's directly trying to inform asset allocation choices off of that. And if the banking industry and the insurance industry have sufficient capacity to understand what climate change means, they can move large amounts of the other private sector by what they choose to insure, what they don't, and where we put money and where we don't put money. And that is a fundamentally big role, and we shouldn't underestimate their capacity, one, already to have and understand climate change, one, to develop better models sometimes than we do in the public sector, and to deploy that in ways which are very profound. So they need to be part of this equation, is my kind of argument here. The other thing that the private sector has to do is continually innovate. They're in the business of continually being profitable, of innovating and delivering new products and services. So this is borrowing from Gartner. And I like the way Gartner positioned this entire exercise. They position this as maverick research for which there is not yet a consensus. And you might all have heard of the hype cycle. So at the beginning, technologies get super loads of interest. That's the top peak. Then everyone goes, oh, it doesn't quite work. So it crashes. You get the bottom trough, which is the trough of disillusionment. And a whole bunch of technologies make their way out and actually make use in society. And so this is an aggregation across all their research, trying to work out what are the technologies that are going through that exercise that are likely to come to market. So you'll see a whole bunch of energy-related products and technologies going through here. A whole number of photovoltaics is a big piece in here, electric generation, vehicles-related activity, logistics, all those kind of things, the more obvious stuff that we know is going to shift. And so another way of looking at it is, if you're trying to develop that product or service, climate change data tells you when and where your product might come to market. Could climate change data actually be a market sizing and opportunity assessment tool if we're to really deploy these products, these mitigation tools at scale? So that's a very different lens and a different take on what data could do in that context, and it's going to have to do. The next one is, so every company's having to manage supply chains. And so it's just taking a very simple product, a very simple consumer product like ice cream. So fundamentally, this is an agricultural product, and we know that all the first pieces of the supply chain and logistic chains to get impacted very directly is that all the agricultural products. So we actually just have a very interesting conversation at the table I was at around could climate data help us inform the different genetic types of crop and where we have to plant them when, so that we can maintain supply. So if not, basically all the milk, all the sugar, all the colourings, all the chocolate that went into our ice cream, its production is going to shift. So if you're an ice cream manufacturer, you have to figure that out. You have to keep your product frozen throughout, so actually the energy cycles and how energy and logistics is changing. And when and where people are going to consume ice cream is going to change. So everything, our most basic everyday product, everything about their supply chain will probably shift in some way. And food manufacturers are going to be some of the first who are having to start to think this through and from the implications for them, actually in increasingly nearer term scales. This is now coming into a horizon of, we have to think about this. And the other thing that the private sector does a lot of is shaping and responding to consumer demand. And rightly or wrongly, one of the first responses has been around offsetting. So this is the travel industry responding to consumer perception around climate impact. In fact, this is supported by a local technology company, Zero Footprint, also a Mars client, helping them understand how to offset information. But this could be any product. This is the kind of first thing we've seen, but nearly all of the products and services we consume will start to shift, and what we do and don't want to consume will start to shift. And private sector is going to have to try and, one, influence that, because they like to shape our preferences, but also respond to it. And so what is the impact on them? So there's a lot of forecasts that actually climate change is a negative economic impact. And if you want that not to be an economic impact, then the private sector has to be able to absorb climate change into all its fundamental activities of managing risk, allocating its capital, helping innovate new products and services in response, supply chain to actually deliver those to them, and shaping and responding to customer demand. And this study struck me as interesting. The top 20% of the S&P 500 who are climate leaders, those it's assessed who are actively trying to build climate change into their businesses, are showing a healthier profit and bottom line in a number of dimensions than others. So there is an argument to say actually this is fundamentally real and is being built into the private sector. Looking at a number of research pieces from Gartner and also Mars' own market intelligence work, there's a number of industry sectors we all kind of understand they're going to be impacted fairly quickly. insurance, agriculture, water, supply chain, manufacturing, logistics, retail. And what those represent, any disruption is a market opportunity. So the flip side of that is there's a bunch of areas we expect more investment to go into as a result. So where should we be, what types of technologies, and where should we be putting our investment in the private sector to develop alternative energy sources that can actually respond to real shift in climate or real needs in the climate or in our society? Again, chemical manufacturing, buildings and building systems are a huge growth area, power, transport, water, and financial services again. So what does it take to try and bridge this gap? So we've had a lot of discussion early on about what are these data products, what are the services, and what does it take to continue to supply that? But these are end markets, and fundamentally there's a very big gap between the availability of information and our ability to apply it to understanding things like supply chain, product development, risk capital, allocation of financial resources. And so what's holding that back? And there's a number of things. So awareness, capacity, other than banking and insurance industry who are investing heavily in acquiring the capability, it's more limited. And more importantly, incentives. Until the incentive, until it becomes real, actually how much demand is there for climate change data and climate change information? So until investors start to put pressure on them, until consumers' preferences change, or until we have a real risk on our supply chain, our financial stability, as those incentives become more and more real, all these end markets will start to then have more demand for services. So the question is, how do we start to translate, and translate between this available information and what we intrinsically know are going to be these demands in the future, and start to build that innovation capacity in that capacity in the private sector to meet those demands? And also for the capacity of the private sector to supply solutions to the public sector and the extended public sector, who are also probably furthest down the line about understanding adaptation. So we could look at a whole bunch of business models you often see around any data economy. There's data aggregators, there's data analytics, there's all sorts of kind of ways we can look at them. But most of them right now in the climate world seem to be data informed. That is to say that, just stepping back a minute, the biggest challenge and why they're all data informed is the resolution. This is fundamentally a spatial temporal problem, and the resolution of our data and the resolution of our understanding at the top doesn't match the bottom. So we don't even necessarily always think about our activities at the bottom of this slide in spatial temporal terms. We heard a lot about all the facets around making climate information more fine-grained, being able to get it down to a resolution that matters, and that's important. We actually don't even necessarily think about the things at the bottom in those terms either yet. So both of those have to occur. And it's why a lot of this, therefore, is about scenario planning and informing human judgments and moral judgments around what the public sector could do and how it can respond. So a lot of the examples are, therefore, what I would term being data-informed rather than necessarily data-driven. And so where are the people who are trying to actually more directly equate what was at the top of that slide to the bottom? Who's trying to use an analytical approach to go from here's what we think about the climate to here's what may impact in my business? And again, it's going to be people like Swiss Re and Munich Re and the reinsurance industry where this is most pressing and they've invested most in acquiring that capability. An interesting one that got a lot of press was Climate Corporation. So this is trying to take climate forecast information and relate it to crop yields, and then relating that through into the insurance industry for crop. And that was acquired for $1 billion by Monsanto. So that's a fairly significant recognition that that's going to impact Monsanto's end-to-end business, that they want the capability to understand climate throughout it. And there's a number of others. And the interesting thing here is that most of the things that are data-informed or really data-driven are probably more using weather than they are climate. So our ability right now is to be data-driven around weather. I think we still actually truly are far off about being data-driven on climate. And frankly, a lot of the other innovations are climate counting for now. They're really trying to count what's happening in the industry, be that in climate, be that in carbon capture, be that in carbon credits, be it in understanding ERP, be it in understanding your end-to-end flow. And what's kind of interesting is that a lot of people are recognizing there's a big gap. So there's a number of innovation groups, particularly Climate Kick, which is an accelerator in Europe dedicated to reducing climate change and climate-driven new businesses. And there's a whole suite of which are very primarily data-driven in doing that. And you're also seeing a whole number of people who have thrown this open to try and increase the innovation potential. So NASA, World Bank, US White House, and a number of others have all launched different forms of climate data challenges or application challenges to try and encourage more people to enter the big gap that exists between data and end use. So how do we bridge that gap more practically? So we have a gap where we have data providers, we have a whole bunch of end markets, and we have some capacity issues in the middle. What we really are looking at here is a systemic change. This is a systems change problem. We're trying to change the system of the private sector to act on and understand climate. So we have to think about this in a number of ways. And when we look at any of our systems change work, we tend to think about how do we create coordination across multiple sectors? Because there is a massive amount of knowledge translation required. We've heard this before on a number of things, but the translation out of what has primarily been the public sector and the academic and the scientific community into the private sector is huge. You also need the incentives. You need to create end demand, you need to create a stimulus. So that's either going to be both private market can do that through the insurance, through moving private capital, but also through the public policy. We can give policy nudges which encourage that. And also being able to foster and support innovation of solutions. People creating new knowledge and new ideas about how to solve this problem. So that is what's currently going to give rise and help us through bridging that gap between an availability of information and a set of latent needs we know we need to apply it to. So I'll let Sasha talk to how we might solve that practically.